This video will be the first in a series on the book Chess Strategy Move by Move by the author Adam Hunt. The book focuses on many key aspects of positional chess and chess strategy as a whole, such as central control, king safety, and pawn structure. This video will focus on central control, beginning with various takes on center control in different openings, and then moving on to various centers that can arise in the middle game, such as the mobile pawn center, closed centers, and fully open centers. A good game to show the classical principles of central control is this game between Richard Reddy and Curly Stirk in 1910. The game starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, the start of the Rio Lopez, with some tension on the e5 pawn. Then knight f6, the pawn on e5 is tactically defended because if there is bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e5, there is this tactical shot, queen d4, and the pawn will be won back. So instead of that, white castles, then black plays d6, defending the pawn, and here white plays an important move, d4, challenging black's center and trying to open the game up since there's still the king on e8. Bishop d7, since there was something of a threat of d5 on the next move, taking advantage of the knight being pinned. Knight c3, just some classic developing moves. Black takes on e4 here to relieve some tension in the center. Knight takes d4. Then after black castles, white plays this move, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. It seems like white has given up the bishop pair and has opened up the b file for the rook with not much compensation. However, we can also see that the knight on d4 is no longer being challenged and black's queenside structure is slightly damaged. We can see right now, queen d3 can potentially take use of this damage to the queenside by sneaking into a6. Queen d3 is just a very good centralizing move, even besides the damage on the queen side, given that you're supporting e4 and potentially allowing the queen to swing over to the king side through g3 or h3. The knight moves to allow for some trades. Now the black knight eyes up e5, and so white plays f4 to add some more control over the e5 square, as well as leave that knight stranded on g4. Here black plays f5, challenging white's center, and white plays rook a to e1, centralizing another piece. Black takes, and here there's an important note. White can take with the rook, the queen, or the knight. However, the best move in this position is knight takes e4. Now the knight that was on c3 is centralized, and all of white's pieces are active. The rook on e1 will still see the whole file, even if it's on the first rank. Black plays queen h4, moving out of the line of sight of the rook. White plays h3, kicking the knight, and now plays knight g5, eyeing up the e6 square, trying to press forward now that all the pieces are centralized and active. d5, the knight comes in, there's a trade, and rook takes allows for this final tactical shot of after c5, knight f5, followed by rook takes f6. Of course, the point being, if rook takes, there's going to be queen takes d5, winning the rook on a8, and if g takes, there's this long sequence of queen g3, queen g7, queen e7, and then g4, winning the black queen. Throughout the game, white exhibited great central control. First with this d4 break here on move 5, then the game opening up some. Bishop takes c6 relieved some pressure for white in the center. Then here we can see white just controlling the e5 square, centralizing pieces, and really just having everything be active, and from there black was just pressed back. Besides the classical style of central control, where pawns are put into the center and stabilized, there is also the hypermodern approach to central control. With this approach, one side cedes direct control over the center and allows their opponent to get a space advantage, while prioritizing developing quickly, controlling the center indirectly with pieces, and creating imbalance, leading to more dynamic and sharp games. This side challenges the center later in the game, hoping to regain space and induce weaknesses in their opponent's position. One opening that embodies the hypermodern style of play is the King's Indian defense for black. While white controls the center with the d and c pawns, black here just develops the knight, fianchettos the dark square bishop, only plays d6 to control the e5 break, and then just castles. Here we can actually see white controlling all of these squares on the 5th rank in the 4 pawns attack of the King's Indian defense, whereas black just castles and sits back. White continues to develop, and here black strikes with c5, attacking the d4 pawn. It should be noted that if d takes c5, d takes c5, the center is beginning to open up while white's king is still in the center. Instead, white plays d5, maintaining the strong center and taking even more space, so black plays e6, chipping away at white's center and trying to break it down. White can develop with bishop d3, and black takes on d5. White takes back with the c-pawn, not wanting to open up the e-file, and here we have a pretty imbalanced game. White has a large center and more space in exchange for having some targets such as the e4 and f4 pawns, and having a more open king. Another hypermodern opening for black is the Grunfeld. Here we can see black once again adopting a fianchetto structure on the king side, and after takes, e4, and a trade on c3, we can see that white once again has this large center that is not really contested by any black pawns. In exchange for white having a large center, however, black gets a monster bishop on the long diagonal, pressure on the center right away with c5, knight c6, again adding pressure to the center, and after both sides castle, we can see here that black has fairly easy development and multiple ways of putting pressure on the center. Moving on from the different approaches to central control, it's important to cover specific central structures that can arise in games, starting with the mobile pawn center. A mobile pawn center is a formation of two or more united pawns in the center, ready and able to advance. A good example of the mobile pawn center is this short attacking game by Paul Morphy. Begins with e4, e5, very natural, an Italian game, and here we see b4, the Evans Gambit, where white gives up a pawn so that after c3, they can play d4 with tempo on the bishop on c5. b4 also opens up the entire c1 to a3 diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, potentially allowing for the move bishop to a3, preventing the black king from castling in the future. Here we see white castling, and then after d6, there's d4 striking in the center just like in the first game. There's e takes d4 and c takes d4, now creating this mobile pawn center. Black moves back and white continues to develop, and then right when black seems ready to castle, the crucial move for white, e5, really trying to break open the entire e-file. Because this move comes with tempo on the knight, it can't be ignored, so after d takes e5, bishop a3 here, as I mentioned before, cutting off the king and preventing castling entirely. Black tries to relieve some pressure by developing and pinning the knight, but there's queen b3, crucially targeting the f7 pawn. Now after bishop h5, d takes e5, the entire center is open, black no longer has any pawns in the center, the knight moves rook a to d1, targeting the queen, queen's forced to move to c8, a very passive square, and now e6, a very important move. A lot of errors here, but it's just to demonstrate all of the potential that white has here. The rook is coming to e1 from f1. Once the e-file opens, the knights can come to d5 and e5. The bishop is still putting pressure on f7, especially with this pawn here. The bishop on a3 is still great at preventing black from castling, and the rook on d1 is completely cutting off this file. Then after black plays f6, trying to not open things up, there's queen b5 pinning the knight, and then after bishop coming back to g6, there's this key move, bishop d5, and black just resigns here. One potential variation that could follow, a6, queen takes c6, really flashy, just sacrificing the queen. After b takes c6 and bishop takes, queen blocking only move, there's just taking, and then the pawn pushes to e7 with checkmate. Things were just shredded open by the e6 move there, and black did not have any defense. Looking back through this game, we can see the crucial move is this e5 break on move 10, allowing this diagonal to open up and preventing black from castling, as well as opening up the central d and e files. Now, after seeing the strength of the mobile pawn center, it's important to show how the opposing side can combat it and break it apart. In this short example from Aaron Nimzovich's My System, we see the creation of the mobile pawn center, which black swiftly deals with, using the important break d5, which is tactically justified, since after e takes d5, there is this knight b6 move, picking the pawn back up and leaving white with an isolated queen pawn instead of the mobile pawn center. If white instead tries to go bishop d3, after a series of exchanges on the e4 square, the bishop is attacked and the pawn on d4 is still a weakness. Similarly, if instead of e takes d5 or bishop d3, white tries to go for e5, this is actually worse, since after d takes c4, this trade on f6, and then knight takes c4, white is still left with this weak isolated d pawn. We now move from discussing the mobile pawn center to a structure that's virtually the opposite, the closed center. This is a position from a game played by Victor Korchnoi in the French defense, an opening that can often lead to locked structures. Now here, after c4 from white, we can see an example of an extremely locked position with the king side, all of the center, and most of the queen side being completely closed. If we go a few moves forward here, we can see that this move a5 prepares the a4 break, which black will focus on executing and maximizing the benefits of, as he will transfer all of his pieces over to that side and try and make the break possible. We can see a little bit of maneuvering here, and after this trade, we will now see the black knight maneuver all the way to c8, the rook on h8 going to a8, and the black bishops moving to d8 and e8. Because the position is so closed, we will see the white dark squared bishop on d2 not move at all, since it doesn't really have any squares. In a position as closed as this, it's important to note the exact moves don't matter as much, and the speed at which you execute your plans isn't as important as it would be in an open position. Here we get to the position where all of black's pieces are set up as I mentioned before, and the king has moved itself to g6 so that it's away from the action. The a4 break happens, and you'll notice how the rooks on the a file will now open up, the knight can come to b6 and then use a4 as a transport square, the bishop on d8 can go to a5 and make use of the diagonal if the b pawn ever moves, and the bishop on e8 is helping support the pawn break and can actually go onto a4 itself and use that diagonal. First, after the recapture, the bishop goes to b6 to defend the rook a7, making sure the bishop on a4 isn't pinned. The knight then reroutes. White here doesn't really have any moves, doesn't have much play at all. Then the king moves. After b3 happens, the bishop comes to a5 to trade off the dark squared bishop. There's really no other option for white. The trade happens. The knight comes to this beautiful outpost on b4. Knight c2 is a fork. The rook tries to take on a4 and white tries to give up the exchange in order to get the b3 pawn. However, after knight c2 check and knight takes a1, the b3 pawn is defended. The game is virtually over at this point. White has no activity. We can see some liquidation, and we can see the white pawn on b2 being taken. And even though it looks like white maybe has some weight of holding on, this b pawn is passed, and after rook a1 check, white resigned since b2 and b1 is unstoppable. Looking back, we can see a lot of important features of playing closed positions. Because pretty much all of the diagonals are completely closed, the bishops for both sides didn't really have much mobility, whereas the knights were able to move around some. We can see here that white tries to trade off one of the bishops, but is still left with a really bad bishop on d2 that ended up not moving at all for the rest of the game. For move 29 here, black spent another 10 moves getting to the ideal position where the king is further away from the action, the bishops are back, the knight is defending the rook on a7, and the rooks are doubled for the a4 break to be possible and the best it can be. And then once the pawn break happened, we can see things really opening up for black, continuing to do some maneuvering, and then just executing the final idea, and really white just had no play this entire time. Now, after seeing a game where black had an unstoppable pawn break where white really had no counterplay, it's important to look at a game showing how to stop your opponent's pawn breaks. This game, also of French, was played between the author and Francisco Vallejo Pons, a strong grandmaster from Spain. We can see the French is on board. This is a win war. After e5, we can see that the center is beginning to get closed, and after a few typical exchanges, and then this crucial c4 move here, we can see the entire center is very much locked, as well as the queen side. We can see black just attack this pawn and just win it easily since white really had nothing to play for there. White on the king side is going for his own pawn break, the f4, f5 pawn break, so black plays this extremely timely move, knight to f5. The author notes that a better move instead of f4 could have been g4, since that would stop knight f5, and the f4, f5 break would have been prepared and able to just go through. However, after f4, knight f5, and this trade, we can see there is no pawn break here. One important thing to note is that even though it looks like this pawn break is being shut down, g4 just looks like it gets captured. After g4, f takes g4, there is this important move f5, and white actually does get this pawn break. However, the author did not see this, instead just playing bishop to f3. We can also see that even though the black king can't castle, it's not being attacked by anything since white has not used any pawn breaks to open up the position, and so it's fairly safe. After queen c6 defending and rook to b1, we can see here how much black is controlling white's pawn breaks. The g4 pawn break is being controlled by the f5 pawn currently. We did see how there's g4, f takes g4 and f5 later. However, it seems like white has abandoned that plan, especially now since the rook has moved from the f file and the bishop is on f3. The e6 pawn break is of course controlled by the queen, the bishop, and the pawn, and black has 2 pawn breaks of his own that he can go for, the g5 pawn break opening up the king side, and the b5 pawn break. The bishop moves to e6, locking things up even more, and even though it looks like the dark square bishop has some really nice squares along this diagonal, it's not really making progress, and white doesn't have any targets along this diagonal. If we go forward a bit, we can see black making a little bit of progress on the queen side, moving some forces over there. Then the knight comes in, the knight moves back. It seems like black was trying to make some progress over there, but couldn't do anything. Now moving its focus to the king side, since now there is this g5 pawn break that comes in. And after this queen comes to here, there is this g4 pawn break attacking the h3 pawn and the bishop on f3, making use of the fact that the rook is on g8 and the queen is x-rayed. After bishop e2, the king moves further away from the side of the pawn break. We saw this in the previous game, where when you have a pawn break in a close position, you can move your king further away. You can take that time. And then here, after bishop d2 and some more moves, we can see that black closes up the entire king side, allows that to happen. Now everything is totally frozen. Again, there is this b4 pawn break that only black has. Now we can see some more maneuvering. We can actually see something interesting. We see the king is going to walk itself to g6 as white focuses more on the center and the queen side. So here we see that happening, just walking over there in the middle of the game. And then after a bit more maneuvering, there is this interesting move right here. If we just skip forward a little bit, if you saw that there, it was the b4 pawn break, which looks like it's fairly defended. However, after this takes, there's knight takes d4, a nice sacrifice. King takes queen a7 with the discovery threat. Rook takes b4, would win a rook here. The king moves d4, opening things up even further. King takes, bishop hanging on g2. King takes again. The queen is just swarming, everything's swarming the white king. And really just things opened up so fast. And then right here, black wins the game and white resigned. We can actually see how quickly that happened, where for so long the game was completely closed. It seemed like neither side was making much progress, and then all of a sudden things moved around. Black prepared, and then this b4 pawn break right here just opened things up. The game opened up right away, and then just black crashed through and the game was over. But the really important things were earlier in this game, where black really shut down white's counterplay, this c4 break, and now the queen side is completely frozen. And now if we look further ahead, after knight takes a4, there's f4, and this important move knight f5, taking advantage of the fact that white didn't play g4. And then after this trade, it looks like white is shut down. Technically there's this move g4, but it was not found. And then after these few moves, we can see that everything is just very much shut down. White has no play here. Already on move 18, things are more difficult for white to play, and even though white has this space advantage, black did a good job limiting activity and really just making sure that everything was prepared properly before pressing forward. The chapter ends its look at the center by talking about the fully open center, where all center pawns have been traded off, leaving open lines for both sides. The game featured is an exciting attacking one between Mikhail Tal and Vasily Smyslov. It starts with a Caro-Kann, and a slightly weird variation with d4 here exploding the entire center, but this liquidation is fine since, as we can see here, white's pieces are active, the bishop's coming to c4, the dark squared bishop has a lot of open lines, and so white seems pretty fine here. After some more development, we see white castle queenside, and in this position, black needs to castle kingside, since really what's going to happen is white's going to develop the light squared bishop, bring a rook to e1, and black cannot afford to have the king still in the center. Now after castles, white plays knight d6, since there was this small threat of knight takes e4, winning a piece. So knight d6, queen a5, and then this move bishop c4, developing simply, b5 attacking the bishop d2 hits the queen, and after bishop a6, importantly, not bishop b3, which would blunder after c5, hitting the queen, and then after c4, the bishop is trapped. But instead, knight f5, which is a good attacking move. The dark squared bishop is hit, as well as the g7 square, which white can make use of later in the attack. After bishop d8, when you look at this next move that Tal plays, you'll see the main principle behind play in open positions. After queen h4, activity over everything. We can see it seems like you're just dropping a piece after b takes c4, but then queen g5 is the move that Tal had in mind, threatening g7. There is this move g6 from Smyslov, but I'm pretty sure that he didn't want to really weaken his dark squares this much, given that his dark square bishop's kind of far away. And Mikhail Tal is right here. Maybe there's some queen h6 and the g5. The dark squared bishop is also poised to go to c3 if necessary. And so here we see knight h5 check. Still, or not knight h5 check, but knight h5. Opening up the attack on the queen and defending the g7 square. And importantly, right here we have knight h6 check, very precise. If we look at queen h5 here, we can actually see that after this move knight f6, there's an attack on the queen and attack on the knight. And after just some simplification here, black takes on a2 and the attack is very, very strong for black. So again, knight h6 check. And then here, queen takes h5 now. This knight looks like it is hanging on h6, but it is very much not. After something like bishop c3 check, f6, queen takes h6. We can see that the rook on f8 is hit. There's potential ideas of rook takes d7, removing the defender, knight g5, taking use of the pin on the f6 pawn, and really this attack is just too strong. So instead of that, black plays queen takes a2, threatening checkmate, and you can play c3 or move your dark square bishop anywhere to get out of this threat. However, most precise is bishop c3, eyeing up this long diagonal, the most active way of giving the king breathing room. Actually, if you look at it, queen a1 check is a very bad move, since after king d2, there are no more checks. The white king is looking very safe on d2, and right now the queen is hit, giving up a valuable tempi. Unfortunately for Smyslov, even though queen a1 wasn't played, he still played knight f6, which is a blunder, since after queen takes f7, this queen cannot be captured due to the back rank weakness. And it was just over here. Queen a1 check, there's some liquidation. But right now, white is just up in exchange, has more active pieces, more open lines, and Smyslov resigned very soon after. This king is actually very safe on e3, and this is just a done game. So this game highlighted a lot of the most important aspects of open positions. First off, you bring your pieces to active squares. We can see here white's pieces all looking very active except for this rook on h1, but that's just one piece. Everything else is very much ready to attack. We can see here after bishop d8, Tal's move queen h4 really exemplifies this idea of activity over everything, since if you try to play bishop b3, there's this move c5, and if you then play queen h4 thinking everything's the same, there's this move c4. Now it looks like, okay, you're losing your bishop the same. After queen g5, knight h5, queen takes h5, it's not exactly the same, since after c takes b3, there is this attack now with this pawn, which if you look in the game, just stayed on c6. If we just go back here, if we look in this main line here, the pawn's still on c6, there's a pawn c6 and c4, and these pawns aren't really part of the attack. But if you look at this move bishop b3, we can actually see that this pawn advances, this attack becomes very strong for black and very fast, and just a lot of initiative is given. These individual tempi matter a lot. This right here, where you play c5 attacking the queen, it's these kinds of things that really decide positions. Very precise calculation and very active play is what leads to victories in open positions. And with that final game, we've reached the end of the chapter and of the video. First, we looked at the difference between the classical and hypermodern approaches to the center, the classical approach being putting pawns in the center and reinforcing them, whereas the hypermodern style is giving up space early, but fighting back in the center later and creating a more imbalanced and dynamic game. The chapter then focused on different pawn centers that can arise in the game, such as mobile pawn centers, the closed center, and the fully open center. The mobile pawn center wants to be advanced and can break open the enemy's position, and as such needs to be dealt with by breaking it up and leaving one isolated pawn by itself. In fixed or closed centers, you want to focus more on the flanks, and the game will take a more maneuvering style given that tempi art is important, and you really want to focus on the important pawn breaks in the positions to eventually open up your pieces and damage your opponent's structure. Open centers usually lead to more dynamic and tactical games where developing quickly and prioritizing activity over everything else is most important. All of the games featured in this video are in a study that is going to be linked in the description, and subscribe to know when the next video comes out.